Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of this making of the shot video. Today, we're gonna color the girl. So before I start coloring, I kinda just wanna talk about the lineless style that Crayon Dragon uses. When I talk about the lineless style in animation, I'm talking about a coloring style that uses shapes and fills instead of having lines describe the character. I kinda wanted it to look sort of crude, kind of like something you'd see that's just been doodled. But I wanted it to still look whimsical, like in the works of Mary Blair, Kevin Dart, and many other artists who share a similar style. So here are some earlier concepts of the characters in which I'm experimenting with the lineless style I'm looking for. I did these in Flash, just using the brush tool, nothing else. As you can see, it's really sloppy, and it's also because this is my first time experimenting with a style like the lineless. But in the end, it made me decide that this is a style I wanted to stick with. However, the way I did it here is very different to how I did it in the end. Let me show you some example files. Here's some colored animation from the film. As you can see, it just looks like the end product, but there's a secret to this. Now, look what happens when I select the selection tool and just highlight this character. What is this? There are hidden lines. What the hell is going on? Well, as you can see, Flash treats the brush and pencil tools different from each other. In Flash, we have the fill properties, which is used for bucket fills and brush tools. Shape properties, essentially. Above it, we have properties for the vector lines. So what I did really was, I drew the whole thing just using a pencil tool, then I filled it with colors using the fill tool. Once all my shape and non-line information was there, I'd select the whole drawing again, and drop the opacity of the line so you can't see it. Therefore, it looks lineless, while technically the lines are still there, but sort of invisible. The good thing about it is that it helped me get the result I was looking for a very short amount of work time I was working with. The thing I absolutely hated about this approach is having to use the pencil tool. The pencil tool in Flash doesn't feel natural like the brush tool. It doesn't feel like you're drawing with a pencil, it just feels like you're drawing with lines that essentially glitch out time to time, and it's very hard to work with when you're filling stuff in, especially if you tackle your drawings in a very sketchy manner. When I was drawing their earlier concept art, I was having a blast because it just felt more expressive and more fun just to draw the characters by strokes only. I'm going to find ways to cheat the style, but I'm going to find ways to have fun with it too. So, let's get started coloring. Now, before we do any coloring work, I'd like to talk about prepping the file first before we get started. I'm going to select all my keys and turn the opacity down to maybe 20%, 3%, something really low, but still viewable at least. So just for the sake of organization, I'm going to rename this layer Rough Animation so it's easier to keep track. Since we're working mostly on colors, you have to consider that colors can come in different values too. So instead of using a normal white background, which is too bright, I'm going to use something more neutral so I can see both light and dark colors. All of my color work will go right under the layer where all the rough animation will be. This is so that the rough will be my guides for something that doesn't use line work. Since there are qualities that I like in my rough animation or tie down, I would like that to be on top so it acts as my necessary guide. Let me tell you this. Drawing animation frame by frame, lineless style in every new drawing is a bitch. It's because there's a lot more thought that needs to go into it, like graphic design and colors and shit like that. So in ways, we do kind of have to cheat things. For this instance, you can see that I'm preparing new layers for her arm, her jacket, her chest area, her shirt, her neck, her head, her hair, separating these things so 1, they're easier to keep track of. 2, if something needs fixing and you know what layer it's on, then it's easier to find the problem. Now, as you can see, I'm already drawing in shapes for things that represent her torso alone or her arms alone, and separating her neck from her head and things like that. This leads to reason number 3. It's easier to cheat things. And when I say cheat, I usually mean problem solving in terms of animating something. With that being said, and the advantage of having a lineless style, they're basically blobs of color alone. So let's say I want to move a torso and an arm. I don't have to redraw both the arm and the torso. I could just shift the torso using a move tool and then maybe use the rotate tool on the arm. Because there's no solid line work that keeps an accent, it's easier to manipulate things when things are lineless. And when I do need to make a dramatic change on her eye or mouth or something, I could just redraw that and leave the head the same way and just shift it a little so it looks like it's been redrawn. As long as you follow your animation principles, it could look pretty convincing. That's why I kept the rough tie down on top of my colors so I can keep track of these accents, the spacing of things, and how I should represent those shapes. I also made a layer just for random line work, so in case there needs to be lines to describe a shape, I can just draw it on this layer, on top of all the blob of shapes. Take note that I just made these layers out of instinct, so they're expected to change depending on what needs to be for the animation file. Now that we basically have everything set up, we can actually start animating these frames. Just like I do with tie down and cleanup, I'm going to start with all the storytelling keys first. Just to remind everyone, the reason why I do this is so that I can in between things easier. So in this case, I'm going to do my last storytelling key since this will be the last thing that people will see. Thanks to the guide I set up on top of my coloring layer, I could easily just manipulate shapes from here on. So as you can see, since I don't have to redraw everything, I could just move things according to the rough I set up. For example, the torso doesn't really make any dramatic changes. Should I redraw it or should I just move it? Well, there are some bits where I do need to redraw a lot. The reason why I decided to do all the storytelling keys first is because there's more contrast. Meaning there's going to be more dramatic changes between the first drawing and the next drawing. So you have to really be decisive on what to redraw and what to shift. For things that have dramatic changes, it's best to redraw them for later on. For things with very little change, like this torso over here, I could just shift it up and maybe use a distort or perspective tool from one of the transform settings. Things like the lips from frowning to smiling, that's a huge change, so I'm just going to redraw that. Since I decided early on to have a bit of subtle wind, I'm going to redraw anything that's her hair. At first, I thought maybe it's best just to shift the head up instead of having to redraw it, but I just remembered that her cheeks are going to be affected by her smile, so hey, why not just redraw it? Oh well. Remember, when you decide to cheat certain things, you have to think about whether it's necessary for your scene. Cheating it might either help it, or it could kill the work. So really put those things into consideration. Because when people can already tell that you just basically shifted shapes, it's gonna stand out. And that's something you don't really want to stand out unless it's on purpose. Now, because the stage of cleanup / coloring is such a long and tedious process, I'm gonna have to speed up the footage so I can get my points across faster. And also, I think I'm starting to run out a lot of things to say about coloring in general. I also forgot to mention that the order of your layers is how your stuff will appear in the workspace. So for example, if your head layer is above the torso layer, it's gonna show that it's above on the workspace. As you can see, I'm kind of doing it in the order on how I did my animation. First, it's my storytelling keys. Then, I gradually move to my breakdown keys. And then my secondary breakdown keys. Lastly, I'll in between it. But before I do that, I want to make sure all my storytelling keys and my breakdowns and my secondary breakdowns are solid enough to convey a story. When I mean story, I basically mean you know what's going on with the colors already. As you can see, I'm still flipping back and forth, so I'm still treating this as if I was animating on paper. Now, while working with a lot of layers can be hella confusing, and besides using the layers to cheat, it could be a very useful tool when you're flipping back and forth. For instance, I just want to focus on drawing the lips or focusing on working with the eyes. I could hide every other layer and just work on the eyes, making sure those arcs work. Then I'll switch back on the other layers to see if it matches, and then I'll just tweak the stuff from there. I think that's the marvel of working with digital animation. You find interesting, yet helpful ways to solve problems. If I were animating something like this back in the day of, let's say, the 80s or 70s, I would be painting on cells, and that would suck, for me at least. With digital though, there are so many problems you can solve faster than doing it on traditional media. Not to also mention that there's instant playback. If I were doing this traditionally, I'd have to do the rough animation on paper, shoot that on a pencil test machine, Then use cells to make the painted stuff, and then shoot it again, and depending if I shoot it on a pencil test machine or some camera that uses film, that could take forever. So digital is a great way to solve problems. I have friends who are traditional purists, especially when it comes to traditional animation. When I was still a student, there was the traditional animation paper team and the people who used TV Paint or Flash, and they just got into these stupid arguments. A lot of the people who animated on paper had such pride because they felt like they were closer to the Disney folks. And sometimes I hear them talking back about the people who do animate on computer, you know, putting them down or talking about how they're not good animators. It got really dumb. There are only few people I know who say they much prefer animating on paper because it feels easier for them. And those kids I was just talking about are not one of those people. In my humble opinion though, animating on paper would definitely help a ton when you're animating on the computer. Animating on paper gives you a discipline because there's no undo button, there's no instant playback, so a lot of the decision making you make on timing and acting poses, they're all based on how you decide on how to pose them out. So when you do decide to animate things traditionally on the computer, it's easier for you to come up with solutions. Let's face it though, it's very rare to get a job in animation if you only provide pencil tests and they are all traditional. But if someone wants to get better in the craft of 2D animation, I would recommend them to animate on paper. It's just hard to access compared to digital programs. And it's time consuming too. I don't blame anyone who decides to work digitally over traditional animation. Though the reason why I flip a lot is because I flip a lot when I animate on paper. So that's an example of something that transferred from animating traditionally to the computer. And I have to say, it helped me a ton. Sorry if I went a little off topic there. I hope it distracted you from the long and tedious in-betweening I have to do. Speaking of in-betweening, this is what I'm doing right now. Since I have all my breakdowns done already, I'm gonna start in-betweening straight on. Into twos mostly. Because the spacing of all the shapes I've done are so tightly close, I can just turn on the onion skinning tool and just draw in between the lines now. All the problem solving I've been doing with the spacing, the timing, the arcs, and the solid drawing has already been done in the breakdown phase, so I already have enough information to use to just in between straight ahead by tracing between the lines. I think that's the only time when I really utilize the onion skinning tool or the light table is when I'm in betweening things that are so close that flipping it back and forth would be more strainful than useful. But if there were still frames that aren't as close as the others, I would still flip back and forth because some of those drawing problems have not been solved yet. As you guys can also see, I'm in betweening each layer one by one. If I did the whole character in one layer, I would be in betweening everything in one go, but since I did it in different layers, I'm tackling each aspect of the girl one at a time. Doing this actually helps me come up with another solution. Some shapes actually don't move as much or aren't very noticeable, so sometimes I don't really in between them as twos like I'm doing to the others, I just leave them as fours or threes. You'll notice it if you really look carefully, but there are some things like the back of her hair that are actually just on fours or on threes because not many people would pick it up, or not many people would pick up that single hair in 2 seconds of animation. Stuff like this will save you a lot of time and a lot of work labor. It would be great if I were to in between this fully, but honestly, it's not really that much of a big deal, so I'm gonna leave it as fours or threes. As long as the more important aspects of the animation like her face, her hair, and a bit of her torso is more active than anything else, that will surely distract the audience from that single hair animation. Well, I think we made it to the finishing line in terms of coloring the girl. It's the most redundant part of the whole thing. So, with all the in-betweens done, in twos and some in threes or fours, let's play this sucker. To simply play it, you press enter. And there you have it, a fully colored red-haired girl, frowning then smiling, all in 2 seconds. Didn't take us long at all. So the next thing we'll do are the miscellaneous things like the lanterns, the effects, and talk about lighting the girl. and later on, export the files to a format in which After Effects can read. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for another episode of the String Bang Workshop. More to come always.